Don Hammerquist is a revolutionary born and raised in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. For 60 years, he has been fighting for a liberatory world. He began in the Communist Party, of which his mother and father were both a part, and then became a founding member of the group Sojourner Truth Organization, also known as STO. In STO, he helped forge a militant and revolutionary political alternative to mainstream leftist politics. This alternative focused on taking bold action, first in factories and later in wider spheres. In STO and after, he and his partner, Janine Porter, have been important mentors to generations of radicals. They've supported core members of Anti-Racist Action, the revived IWW, and a number of U.S.-based revolutionary organizations in the 2000s, such as Bring the Ruckus. In 2001, Don and Janine left their longtime home in Chicago to return to the forest that Don grew up in. However, they continued to politically engage with revolutionaries and activists across the United States. Don has written extensively over the past 20 years about many important strategic questions facing the movement, always discussing and talking with folks close to the action. Until recently, most of these writings were little known and inaccessible. Now a selection of these writings have been published in a book titled A Brilliant Red Thread from Chris Blebedeb Press. They offer a powerful tool for militants today struggling with the creation of a new and more liberatory society. The following interview was conducted with Don as a supplement to the book and to further explore Don's ideas and political experiences.
Okay, Don, you wanted to say a few things about what you did and didn't want to prioritize in this conversation.
There were a bunch of questions developed that I really felt were not the way I should proceed. They were essentially questions where people were asking, what are your answers to X, Y, and Z? And the whole approach that I'd kind of like to emphasize and hopefully have emphasized is those are generally issues that aren't discovered, and you don't discover them particularly by talking to old people, or checking out old literature, asking for responses. They're discovered through a process that's creative, because the answers are going to be created. They're not going to be discovered. And so I would much prefer to talk about just what in retrospection I see as it's kind of unique to be able to stay active over an entire life and not lapse into cynicism or some kind of form of comfort. And I've managed to do that longer than most, way longer than most. And so I'd like to really emphasize how that happened, how I see it happen, what was fortuitous about it, and accidental, and what maybe perhaps contains some things that people can learn from.
That makes sense. In that light, do you want to start with maybe the influence of your parents and your parents' politics, in particular your father?
Yeah. One of my first memories is going with my father. He was a logger. They were seasonally unemployed, and he was going up to a logging camp where they'd set up a remote unemployment compensation grouping, and there were a lot of loggers there, like 50, 75 of them, all signing up for unemployment compensation. And we were in line. I think I was about second grade, and this guy came up to my father and said, they're building a concentration camp. They're reopening a concentration camp in Tule Lake, California, and I'm going to see to it that you're the first person in it, which was an extremely uncomfortable thing, though my father and the people around him just kind of laughed it off. And
Yeah.
this guy was also a deputy sheriff or something. In any case, that kind of indicates something about how my sister and I experienced the radicalism of my parents. I mean, we were both insulated from it and part of it. And my father particularly was a very well-known open communist, and a trade, open also. This was a time when being a communist out here was essentially being a radical trade unionist, usually a radical logger, and he was that. So he also was an ex-Wobbly who was not so ex. And so he maintained a lot of the Wobbly traditions of rotation of leadership, no contracts, no dues check off.
Right.
No union official got paid more than the average worker's salary, and the emphasis was not on a contract; it was on power on the job, power at the point of production. So, those were positions he advocated, both through in the party structure he operated in, the union structure, but also in job situations. So anyway, that flowed over into his attitude towards political organization, which is very influential to me. And essentially it was know what you think and act according to that you're acting according to what you think, not what you think you should think. Stay clear of too much following of leaders. Beware of leaders, essentially, and be sure that if a leader turns out to be rotten, that you're still confident of where you've been. And that was a position that he argued, sometimes not too successfully with me, but where he always ultimately proved out to be right.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, you've said that there were a lot of times where he was far to the left of you when you were active in the Communist Party.
Yes.
What kind of questions was he to the left of you?
Well, like in general, like everybody who was in the party at the time who was active, which actually was a minority of party people because most weren't active, one way or another, we were emphasizing gaining influence in certain kinds of structures. So in Oregon, we essentially took over the Democratic Party. The youth section of the Communist Party did. And of course, this was in a period when, practically speaking, there were no really elected Democrats. So the Democratic Party's out of power, and like in 1964, the Oregon Democratic Party demanded full representation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, immediate withdrawal from Vietnam, nationalization of certain basic industries, and that was the policy the Democratic Party from Oregon took to the National Democratic Convention.
Wow.
And we won all that. And so, we were relatively big-headed about it. And my father said, that stuff's not going to be important. That stuff is going to be lost, because the Washington Communist Party at one time was regarded by the National Democratic Party as having established a Soviet. So they sent people from the National Democratic Party out here to purge the local Democratic Party because they said this was the Soviet of Washington. And in my memory, like the president of the Washington Senate and the head of all the major industrial unions, some massive organizations like the Washington Pension Union, which was like 50,000, 75,000 people. They were all CP organizations, and like there were 4 congressmen in the party. In any case, he said that's lost really quickly. And so it's on the reform revolution question that he was always a constant pressure from the left. And also later when I was playing kind of a factional role in the party, I think kind of maybe a bit of an understatement, I just discovered a letter from him saying, just cut out the crap, come home, make a frontal attack on Gus Hall's nonsense, and forget all this stuff about he has working class background.
And what lessons do you think that contains that still apply? I mean, that's a very different time, but some of those, I think you're saying, continue on being relevant.
Well, I think there's a range of other things about his position too, but the emphasis on organization, but not on critical participation. The emphasis on thinking and trying to think about what you're going to do in a collective framework with other people, and then actually implement them, and recognizing the capacity of normal people to participate like that, and a total opposition to notions of the kind of militarized notions of centralization and discipline. Just all of that, I think, has been important to me and was definitely crucial to him, and was the reason why he got expelled from the Communist Party, then readmitted, and then was up for expulsion again when he died.
We started this by talking about how his influence has helped you stay involved for so long. Can you connect that thread a little bit? How does that legacy we're just talking about help you stay involved for many decades?
Well, I'm not sure that it works particularly in that way. It deals more with the content of the positions that I eventually adopted than with actually my persistence in them. But I mean, he did persist a long time. In fact, when he died, one of the infinite number of reasons why I was in trouble with the Communist Party is I wrote his obituary, and it said, always a revolutionary inside and out of the party. So that's, I guess, I mean, he died fairly young. So, but I guess that's how he helped me kind of. There's just a number of things about him too. I mean, I think he left school in the 8th grade, and he went to work. He was a seaman in Barcelona when he was 17, and writing stuff, and was in the IWW Seamen's branch, and also in the logging union branch.
You mentioned those positions of his that helped influence your positions, and a lot of those I think are reflected in the book, but there's a long gap, right? We're talking about the early 60s when you're in relationship with your father, and this book is stuff from the new millennium. Can you talk a little bit about what positions you developed when you were most active politically in Sojourner Truth organization, maybe potentially in the split from the CP, and then afterwards. We'll drill down into more specifics than that, but getting into your positions.
Well, essentially, in the fractional period in the CP, we were attempting to argue against stage theory strategies and against any kind of notion that there was any politically viable intermediate step between revolutionary anti-capitalism and the existing reality. And so that was always obviously a big issue in the stuff in STO and later. And in that context, I became familiar with Gramsci positions, notions of dual power and so on developed there, of positional and situational struggle. And basically a rejection of the entire Stalinist organizational model and the Plekhanov ideological approach to history and consciousness. That's a mouthful.
Well, maybe we can come back to the ideas too, but maybe talk a little bit about the activity that you were involved in. One of the things, we were looking at some documents earlier that was from the workplace organizing that you were involved with in Portland right after you left the Communist Party, but I know that workplace organizing was an important part of your early work at that point.
We had a substantial communist youth group in the party, very loosely in the party. Like, the main reason they were in the party was because my wife and I were in the party. And a number of them were ex-students, but we very quickly moved away from any focus on student-type activity, and so we played a major role in the Oregon farm workers organizing stuff, in organizing migrant workers, and then as people got into a situation where they had to get jobs, we started factory concentrations in a number of, I think, pulp industry, Crown Zeller back in Camas and Washougal. We had a number of foundries. I mean, Oregon was not really, didn't have really major big industries like other places did, but we had workplace groupings, and so we organized, attempted to organize roughly in the same way we did later in STO. Groups of workers inside the plant organized around issues on the shop floor, not just contract issues. And then strike support too. We did a bunch of strike support. Yeah, I was arrested for attempted murder.
Tell that story. What was the claim that you had attempted to murder somebody?
The victim had claimed I attempted to murder him. It's just, we had a strike at a place in Northwest Portland called Fry Roofing that produced the roofing that Sears and Roebuck catalogs sold. And it was an extremely interesting strike. In any case, the company operated with scabs a couple of times, and we had a couple of major pitched fights stopping the scabs, and people were run over, and a couple of people got broken legs and so on. So in any case, we had this major fight at the gate, and the scabs and various company people came running out, and everybody picked up 2x4s, and we were wailing away. And the plant manager came out with a 8mm camera strapped around his neck, and I grabbed it and threw it away without detaching it from his neck. So I was arrested and accused initially of attempted murder, which quickly was dropped down to felonious assault. But it was interesting because the whole thing happened right at the time of the Portland Black Panther uprising. So we were down at the same time protesting a bunch of Panther busts in the police station and confronting some really fucking racist Portland police people. And I was having to go in for a booking for attempted murder, and there were various people who were indicating that they were kind of intent on killing me. And they were uniformed. Anyway.
Yeah, not to go too much further into it, but you've said that, I've heard you say that the Fry strike was one of your first experiences with the realities of repression and the sort of complex issues of repression in these struggles. Can you talk a little bit about how that played into that struggle?
I'm not sure just what you mean by repression. The complexities of it were the role of various quasi-police apparatuses. Like, there was an armed private security guard system that actually guarded the plant and was over. There was the plant had also hired another private security firm to infiltrate the strikers, and so our group they had an infiltrator in our group, and they set up a number of strikers and a couple of our people in a attempt to burn down the plant, and which they all got busted for, and there was a major arson kind of issue. And I mean, the layers of repression that were involved there were pretty, it wasn't just the cops and you,
right.
You know, it was the cops and the private cops and the semi-secret private cops and the totally secret private cops.
Yeah.
And they were all involved.
Yeah. We started talking about how things that have allowed you to stay involved for a very long time, and you raised a few things when we were preparing for this. The first thing we talked about is your dad, but the second thing we talked about is your partner Janine. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I do, but there's kind of some intervening things.
Sure.
First, I think everybody's experience is that there are certain times when there's an organizational momentum that kind of sweeps everybody along, and that was definitely the case beginning with me from the early 60s up through the early 70s. You know, along with everybody else, everything was getting bigger and more radical, and it was very easy to stay involved. And the problem that always develop after that.
Right.
You know, what do you do to consolidate it or to fragment after it? And so for me initially, it involved attempting to implement a clearer vision of what I thought was an approach to strategy through STO, but that was trapped up in the falling momentum of the overall movement.
Right.
You know, we were trying to do things that could not really be done. You can't really organize militant groups at the point of production when in fact production is being shut down and moved to a different part of the country and eventually to a different country. And it's not it's not a sustainable process. You have to find some other stuff, something else to keep you going. And so far as the current movements are concerned, I mean, it's real easy to see generations of struggle that come in around certain kinds of major break movements, and then fragment and fizzle in various kinds of cynicism and demoralization. Now, so far as my relationship with Janine, I'd be dead without her. And I certainly would have been dead politically 35 years ago without her. Because in the same way as my father, she's a constant pressure to the left and to radicalism and to making the choices that aren't the kind of acceptance of defeat choices. And also, because of my relationship with her, we always were able to have a viable set of interests and so on that were outside of politics, that weren't dependent on the political stuff, like music, all during the 80s and 90s in Chicago, and various kinds of anti-logging company, salmon restoration activities, where we frittered away all kinds of time and energy out here, and still to some extent do, insofar as I can walk, which is like 3 or 4 steps at a time. Anyway, I don't know. There's more to say. I'd feel more comfortable saying it if she weren't sitting here looking over my shoulder. But she is.
Maybe talk a little bit about what you all did in the 80s and 90s as the political waves that you were a part of fell, and how did you maintain contact with new generations and maintain contact with the broader community?
Particular focus on workplace organizing, workplace concentration, and so on. But we also had a focus on liberation, on support, participation in national liberation groups. And we had numerous important ties with essentially all of them. You know, from Iran to Ireland, the Southern Cone grouping in Latin America, and so on. And that work continued on. And I have to say, it continued on despite the fact that the phenomena we were supporting was growing increasingly corrupted, I think. And I mean, along with the palpable rot of socialism, there was a parallel rot of the national liberation perspective, and it became what it is now. You know, it became a form of incorporation, but we hung with it. We hung with it with groupings that were also getting smaller, but we're getting smaller in a different way than the other section of the left. You know, than our section, which, you know, just led to people saying, "What the hell? I'm going to go back to school. You know, I can't organize workers. I'm going to go back and become a professor." The way it happened for them is they got smaller and smaller and slightly more desperate groupings, and their repression got higher, and they went underground, and you had people who, you know, were in jail, were in jail for life, were underground and trying to avoid that situation. and we were in a position of supporting them and working with them. And the political potential was really not there, but the moral obligation was tremendously there. And so that was one strand of what we were doing. The other strand was we had decided that our approach was such that we weren't adequately confronting the state and capital in our attempt to confront workplace power. And that we had to form organizations that were more militant and confrontational, and not just ones that would kind of represented the grievances in a workplace situation particularly. And so we attempted to move into a variety of other activities, anti-fascist activities, a bunch of anti-militarism stuff, and to do it in a way that emphasized non-cooperation with the state, militants, breaking with the pattern of kind of legitimate accepted protest. And that also, combined with the other things we were doing, increasingly put us in a position where we thought we were taking risks that were really monumentally incompatible with the potential rewards. So the fact of having other things, like a relationship to music, to the developing punk community, was important. And along with that, we had the side benefit of developing working relations with the ingredients of what became the anti-fascist movement from early on, from the anti-war, white, what's his name, Metzger's war group.
White Aryan Resistance.
White Aryan Resistance. And some connections with parallel stuff in England, so on.
Why do you think that these younger cohort at the time, people who became ARA, who were involved in anti-fascism stuff, why do you think they were drawn to you and Janine politically?
Because we took them seriously. And because we didn't have the approach that the other groupings that were doing, the other left groupings that were doing the work had, which was, to see the work essentially as an adjunct to building their organizations, really, and to not treat fascism and the potential of fascism seriously.
The other groupings didn't treat it seriously.
Didn't.
Let's talk about the third thing. The third thing that you feel like has helped your career, or at least been a strong influence in it, is the state and the FBI in particular.
Yes.
And I'm curious to hear more about what that influence was and what role you think it played. We have some documents.
Yeah, some documents. But it's real easy, particularly when you're young, to get kind of, I believe Stalin called it dizzy with success. And to think that you're doing incredibly well in what you're doing. And so what happened, I felt that way because I was sort of a big factor in Oregon for a while. I was in the news, so to speak. And Time Magazine, I made Time Magazine. It's kind of embarrassing to read it, but I made it. And so I thought, along with the fact that, this was in the context of a fight inside the party, I'm on the way, we're on the way. And then The FBI COINTELPRO documents were seized in Media, Pennsylvania, I think in '72, and an enterprising reporter in Oregon went and got the COINTELPRO documents for me before the FBI had gotten around to their normal process of deleting, changing, modifying, and attenuating them so that you couldn't tell anything from them. So I got a copy of my FBI file, or a portion of my FBI file. Essentially, it's my Portland COINTELPRO file with some response from the National. And it indicates in absolute terms that they started out with the normal approach, which was to expose, decided that I liked exposure. Then they started to discredit and went through the normal things of marital infidelity letters, letters to Gus Hall that I was disloyal, which is totally accurate. And they started out with all those kind of things to discredit me with party leadership. And then they had an epiphany, an epistemological transformation, decided that instead of doing that, because I was so disruptive in the party, they should promote me. So they decided that I should be promoted as a new left disruptive element, because that would be a more effective use of me. And in looking back, I could see that then a whole bunch of things happened to me that I had thought were because of my real importance, which were clearly being facilitated by the other side deciding that I should be promoted because I was good for them, my promotion. And that gave me a healthy skepticism about leadership and about getting kind of too taken with what's going well, what's not going well, and why that's the case. And I think knowing that, it also helps me persist, because you're less likely to be caught unaware and taken aback by people who suddenly become not what you thought they were. And I don't mean just agents, but become reformists and so on, sell out, and whatever.
So you mean that understanding that the playing field of politics is much more complicated, and what you do is impacted by a whole host of actors, many of whom are your enemies,
Yes.
helped you stick through the rough parts.
Yes. And maybe doing it more generally too. I mean, that you have to look at other things that are going on, at least partially in that kind of context. So I don't know if you would say that sustains me, but it certainly makes you humbler about what you're doing and thinking.
Things that I think is really impressive about the book is that it's a very high level, sophisticated intellectual work, but you're someone who didn't finish college, you never went back to grad school, and I think a lot of people have a hard time envisioning doing high level theory or even analytical work outside of the formal academy. And I'm curious what you think has helped you do that, and what role you think, what you think has helped facilitate engaging high level work without being a grad student.
The 2 years that I spent in college was basically sullen resentment, and then fighting with the professors and getting expelled from a couple of classes. But I don't know, there has to be a sense, you have to begin from a sense that everybody, I mean, this is a Gramscian sense, that everybody's a philosopher, that everybody can think, which is Badiou, also everybody has the capacity to think. and that particularly part of my lucky fortuitous thing was I was with groupings of people, some of the people I was with in the Communist Party youth grouping that were accidental communists in Portland, and then some of the people in STO. It was possible to think in a collective way, to have discussions where you could actually formalize issues and consider alternatives without fragmenting in the process, at least not doing it instantaneously. And that's beginning with the mindset that this work is necessary. I mean, there's a whole approach that maintains it's not necessary, that you can have a division of labor where some people think and some people act. And that's widespread even among leftists that would kind of argue that they don't have that position. That's how they actually organize. But you have to have the position that it's within the capacity, and that is also an objective. It's also a capacity you should attempt to work up and work out. And so I've had the opportunity of dealing with people in that kind of way, and that extended right up past STO into the grouping of anarchists that were kind of the ARA initiators that we worked with in beginning like in 1995 and up through right now. And I don't know, it just there's so much difficulty with the academic framework for understanding the potential of breaks and so on and changes that allow people who aren't politically active, aren't politically effective, to transform themselves. I mean, it's very difficult to deal with that. I think you're putting yourself in the position of teaching when you should be learning. Anyway, that's I don't know what more I would say on that. I don't know what more I would say on that.
What do you see? What do you see as the symptoms of not prioritizing the unity of thinking and acting? What happens to an organization if they even implicitly divide that labor?
Well, what has happened to essentially every organization is they will die. They will die, or they will become some kind of a party state type formation, where their success will turn out to be a form of death, which I think you'd have to say about like the Bolshevik collective. But
one thing, just to come back to the break idea, can you say more about what you mean by an epistemological break, or people transforming in a moment, having a qualitative difference in what they are capable of doing and thinking?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an idea that's essentially present in Gramsci, and I think it's hinted at in some Lenin stuff, in like his phrase about sometimes decades happen in weeks. But in Gramsci, it's a process of abandoning the common sense that's imprinted and developing an autonomous personality that's actually reflective of the potential of an alternative civilization, a working class. I mean, I'm getting a little wordy here, but
I mean, that's an evocative phrase, an alternative civilization.
yeah, he has extremely impressive arguments about someone stopping being an object and becoming a subject of their own history. And that was intellectually, it was very attractive to me. And that's where we got the notion of epistemological break, which is also used by Althusser but in a really different kind of way, which I think is not really even compatible. But I've got to say, one thing that may be helpful in understanding how these kind of things come about is I went to this International Communist Party school in 1966. It was for the U.S. and the Canadian parties. There was a 3-month school. It was a substitute for the going to Moscow that had been done previously. So there were 12 of us from this country, and I think 6 or 8 from Canada. And we had this 3-month session, and they wouldn't let us read Marx. They said Marx too difficult.
Wow.
We couldn't read Marx, and we weren't allowed to read and discuss Marx. We weren't allowed to read and discuss anything from Lenin other than the what is to be done, left-wing communism, imperialism. And so all of us, we had a major rebellion against that. Not that we could do anything about it because we didn't have the books there. And it was kind of regarded as subversive in the party school if you showed up with capital, with the book. Plus we weren't allowed to bring anything into Canada. But in any case, that kind of anti-intellectualism, I mean, my father has a bunch of things about Gus Hall's attitude towards the youth, and I've also wrote something at the time about Gus Hall's attitude towards recruiting, recruit only the youth who have not yet thought about anything, don't have no thoughts in their head. But at that point, there was no Gramsci. I mean, Gramsci essentially had not been translated in 1966. So I was just introduced to some fragments of his stuff then. And also the Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts weren't widely available. I think they were just put in English a few years before that. And so we got a chance to read that. And that was a basis for a big kind of challenge to the leadership of the International Party School, because that was a challenge to the whole attitude towards work and towards labor, the strange labor concept, the notion of alienation and so on, none of which had anything to do with the party's notion of exploitation, which was purely reformist and trade unionist. Anyway, that was we got kicked out by the Mounties.
Did the counselors, the instructors of the camp call the Mounties on you all?
No.
Oh.
Restaurant on Bloor Street in Toronto, where we had most of our sessions, and in comes the Mounties, and they said, you have 24 hours to leave Canada, and they had all our names.
Wow.
And so we were put on a train, and with Mounties on the train, and sent down to Niagara Falls. and expelled. And we did our last 1 month of the school in New York City. But I love that the Mounties coming in and expelling us.
Don, can you talk about some times when you feel like in your activity you are like becoming a subject of history?
Present circumstances accepted?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think there have been such times. There have been a lot of frustrations because I felt, hey, I should be being a subject here, and instead I'm just kind of an observer at best. I mean, that's always kind of a frustration of activism when it just never occurs where you are properly. You know, it breaks out elsewhere. And I mean, that's sort of the big-headedness of activism, I suppose, but it's definitely a psychological factor. And it's what, you know, in my initial generation of activist workplace organizers, that's one of the major deadening things is, you know, you make a commitment to like a year, 2 years, and there is no strike, there is no nothing, and then you get word the plant's closing down and moving, and so you got your only struggle potential is a purely defensive one that you know you're going to lose. And everybody else that you're working with knows they're going to lose, and the ones that have the most initiative, you know, are out looking for another job. So I guess that answered your question in the negative.
Well, on that note of somebody becoming the subject, maybe not you, one of the things that's very evident in the book is thinking about how self-proclaimed radicals and people who want to be revolutionaries should relate to struggles that appear behind your back or off your peripheral vision. You know, I think a lot of us had that experience in 2020 where we were doing our own thing and then all of a sudden something's happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I mean, that's the main thing I would say is that people have to be prepared for that. They have to be prepared for that kind of break. I mean, obviously the party not only was not prepared for it, they opposed it when it happened. And so our experience was opposing the opposers. You know, we were opposing the people in the party who wanted to suppress the French general strike. Thought that was a good idea that, you know, the students were having too radicalizing an impact on the workers. And, you know, it should be confined to a normal trade union set of objectives.
Oh yeah. Do you want to say some things about Janine since she's not sitting over your shoulder? Or it's going to you'll eventually see it, so.
Her stuff with the music, I mean, that really sustained us. I kind of resisted it at the time, but we got very close connections to, I think, kind of culturally important sectors of like alternative country, the Texas, West Texas rock people. Anyway, that stuff sustained a lot and maintained a lot of connections, which we still have. And it also, it just gives some meaning to what you're doing, you know. So it's not just fucking work and disappointment after disappointment. And we're really, I mean, we were going through a situation where a large number of people were disappointing us big time. I mean, we had people like Knoll going back to Harvard, you know, which, I mean, there were problems with Knoll, but he was a comrade, and, you know, here he becomes like kind of a cartoony steelworker advocate from Harvard, and starts functioning politically essentially as a provocateur, as somebody who just exemplifies not being willing to do what he advocates other people to do. I mean, there was that kind of disappointment. And then there was a disappointment with all kinds of people who just got cynical. You know, good people who just got cynical and tired. But on the other hand, you can understand that they had to, you have to make a living. You know, you do get old, and when you do, you've got to survive, and it's not, I mean, we're testament to the fact that it's not that easy. I don't know. Plus, there's the whole, you know, the whole international stuff. I mean, we had confidence and relationship with one section after another of the international movement. I mean, we were very close to Poterio Pio and I forget the name of the other one. But to the initial Italian groups, and then we had close relationships with Big Flame and some other groups in England, and close relationships with the groups in Ireland, and they became bad. You know, they just, a lot of the Italian ones, a lot of the people turned state. You know, when they got busted, they turned state's evidence. And Big Flame kind of merged with the Labour Party, and the Irish, and now they run the country. And that is really fucking demoralizing. And, you know, then we had the relationship with the Latin, the MLN, and your armed struggle for free, independent Puerto Rico, and suddenly he's in Congress.
So one thing I know a lot of people are going to be curious about is your thoughts on the far right and the potentials for fascism, especially how you feel like your ideas have changed since 2000 when the book Confronting Fascism came out, and you're working closely with ARA, and now we've had the last 20 years of historical developments, Trump, the alt-right, you know, international right-wing turns. I'm curious if you have some thoughts on what that arc looks like and how people should be thinking about it.
Well, in some ways my position is the same. And the same in the sense it's got the same limitations that it had before. I mean, when I first began writing about the potential for fascism seriously, it was in like the 1983 document. I'd forgotten I had it in there, but I saw that copy and I see I did. And, you know, I was seeing it as sort of a logical outgrowth of the crisis in capital, of the lack of capitalist flexibility, and the development of barbarism alternatives to capital, that could look to a potential base in the increasing precarity of labor and the increasing redundancy of labor. So when I wrote the when I wrote the piece with Sakai, that Sakai criticized, I was not really. There were a lot of people, including people in STO, that knew a hell of a lot more about fascist trends in the U.S. Lenny Zeskind and Ken, who actually studied it. What I was concerned with was anti-fascism. I was concerned with the complacency in the left about the potential issue and the assumption that the terrain of revolution was given to us, and essentially we didn't have to worry about it, and fascists could be kind of discarded into a less likely adjunct of capitalist power, less likely to be brought into play. And then there was the whole tendency to reduce fascists to the stupidest of them, and to think that that's all they were. And so it was a critique of the left. It was not really a clarification of what's going on with fascism. Matthew Lyons has done way more of that, and so I got my problems with Lenny Zeskind since he left STO, but so is he. And so I don't know. There was a lot more of it that was overt, a lot more third position Strasserite stuff that was clear in the around the turn of the century with the American Front, and there were large groupings in Canada, and their politics were much more defined, much more radical, much more clearly anti-capitalist. It seems to me that what's happened is the growing mass potential of a mass oppositional right wing has been increasingly sucked into reformist potentials. The Turner thesis essentially had the fascists seizing power and revolutionary overthrow of the existing power, but there was always the potential to infiltrate the power and to kind of move it out via coup. And they had that notion that they could do it, that they could get into power via the electoral process, taking over the Republican Party. And I think it's that, along with, I think, a probably pretty extensive state oppositional campaign, has really undermined changed the landscape of the right since 2000, between 2000 and now. I think that's phenomena. That's not the underlying essence. I think the underlying problem is still the crisis in capitalism, the masses of displaced, marginalized proletarians, of mass movement of labor, and the social unrest that's going to come from that, especially as it increasingly infects, I don't know if infect is the right word, but impacts this country. And so I think the potential for a rapid increase in anti-system, revolutionary type activity on the right is very real and is greater now. But the reality of it is less.
And what do you think how do you think that impacts our strategy on the left? How should how do you see people relating to it that you think is promising and that you think is less promising?
I think we have to relate to the worst possibilities. I mean, I think my tendency is to, and I think the way stuff I've written has been interpreted too, is to look at the worst possibilities and write about them in a way that implies they're what exists, or people can draw that implication from them, and that's a problem. You know, you've got to fight against the fascism that actually exists, but you've got to prepare for the fascism that might exist too. And I think it's just extremely rash to assume that they'll always be as stupid as they have been, even though they're providing evidence that they will be. But it's extremely rash. So that's why I have the, watch out for the beer halls, the Munich beer halls.
Well, one of the things you also said earlier was thinking about the strategy of anti-fascism as something that is supposed to be growing the left anti-capitalist response and not something that's just there to impact the balance of power, and that our role should be our own rather than just being preventing some laws from getting passed or some people from getting into power.
Yes, I mean, the outcome of the anti-fascist stuff has to be also to begin to develop the framework for an alternative to capitalism that is not the fascist alternative, and that goes beyond like the insurrectionist objective of chaos, which I think, is likely attainable without us doing much. And further, it's likely that, the problem is it's attainable without us doing much, and that little we do, people can look at it as if it's really indistinguishable between what the fascists are doing. And it's kind of, two arms of the same body or whatever. I mean, it's the terrain for a red-brown, red-black, red-brown unity that I really worry about. And that's why it's so important to begin developing the anti-fascism in a way that's got an anti-capitalist alternative that's clear. And so much of the anti-fascist stuff doesn't have that. The best is the insurrectionist, and the worst is really reformist and pro-state. And the other element of my position, is what I think is very important, is the use of the fascist threat in order to sustain a social democratic rule that is a social democracy without the material rewards for the working class. And that's been a major theme of everything I've written since 1980 or so, is that in this country and in a number of countries like it, our problem, the likelihood is for a social democracy that sustains itself through a fear of a fascism that's real but also partially fabricated. That it's a fascism that has real elements and is a real threat, but also it's a partially fabricated threat. And that's the scene I think we're in right now. And except now, the capitalist class, there's such a descent into incompetence in the ruling class in this country. At least it seems that way to me, unless they're really incredibly smart and I just can't see it. But it seems to me that certain elements of their own strategy aren't being properly implemented by the ruling class. You know, their approach towards austerity and towards social reaction and stuff like that is not consistent with the kind of equilibrium that they might have the potential of obtaining, but they persist in it. And I don't quite understand why, or whether it's temporary or whether it's localized, but it can't work.
Right.
I don't think it can work. You know, if you're going to, you're not going to be cutting the pensions and so on as the major element of your policy if you're attempting to maintain a social democracy against the fascism, you know. So even Macron and certainly, you know, the Republican stuff here.
One thing I find really interesting about the book is that it's primarily a collection of emails and things that were either on blogs, but it's kind of a product of that, of the arrival of the internet as a medium for discussion and thinking. And I'm curious to hear your reflection on what it was like around when the book starts in 2000, when you moved to a more rural area, but had a lot of new avenues for discussion with people. And some of the people you were talking to are much younger and, you know, were in different new contexts and projects that were exciting at the time. I'm curious to hear what that experience was like for you.
Well, it was important to me to become computer literate too, which I wasn't until we came out here. In fact, some may say I'm still not. Before we moved out here, like particularly the last 10 years or so before we moved out here, we had a working political grouping in Chicago that included, you know, a dozen and a half core collective that was taking some kind of responsibility for a variety of stuff. It was not a disciplined organization or anything, but it did exist regularly, and through it, I mean, there were problems with it developing discussions of things that should be discussed, but a lot of the stuff that I now write about, I could raise there. And Janine and I could raise there, and we could discuss with people who were in a position to implement it and in a position to not implement it too. So you'll see a bunch of the things on organization relate to people who were involved in that. And that was important. Another thing that was important to me is after my second marriage broke up and I got together with Janine, which was like 1980, we didn't have a typewriter. You know, we did not have anything to do any work on, and I write very pedestrian way, very slowly, and a lot of rewriting, and it's hard to do on a typewriter, especially when you don't have one. So a lot of the stuff that I've written since coming out is stuff I had thought about prior to it, and just hadn't been in a position to write it down and circulate it. Also because, you know, working full time. Anyway, the main problem with all that, the main problem is getting a real dialogue and exchange. You know, it's getting things regarded as provisional and open to challenge, and you know, laying out alternatives rather than definite courses ahead. So that, and I don't know how successful I am in that. It's definitely what I try to do, and that's one of the reasons why, I haven't emphasized getting things published, or might also be I didn't think there was going to be any possibility for it too. Nobody was coming around requesting material to publish either. So,
Yeah.
but just, it's important to me to stir up some kind of a ferment where people aren't looking someplace for a clear path ahead and definite principles and so on to act out, but are looking for developing a process to think about it, and to think about it in a framework where there's at least some real potential to act out what you're thinking about, and some real pressure to do that, so it's not just abstract. I read some some of these left things that, like New Left Review kind of stuff and so on, and European intellectual discussions of strategic questions, and my God, there aren't 10 people in the world that'll understand what you're saying, that understand your language, and you don't seem to care. It doesn't seem to make any difference to you, and how can you possibly see functioning that way? And really, if you do function that way, all you're left with is this kind of incestuous raking over your own friends, But even Badiou, who I love, why do you write in that way? And it's hard for me not to think that, one of the really, really kind of demoralizing things about the current situation is, right now, like today, there's general strikes going on in virtually every European country. And they're not just, the typical French CP general strike, the routine May Day one, but they're like, every other week we're having a general strike and shutting this down, and their objectives are so fucking minimal. Why would you do a general strike, which is kind of a large step away from power, and you're doing it to ask for something that I'd like to have a good thing we had 20 years ago, which was a horrible thing. And that, I was first struck by that horrible disjunction, and it's in the piece that I wrote on Madison and Egypt. It's in Madison, you have a general strike that took over the state capitol building, and I forget what they were asking for, but it was some trade union thing, like the trade unions, it was fucking nothing. That's what they were having the general strike for.
We were talking about Madison and the contemporary stuff going on in Europe, and just how to deal with situations where there's a high level of militancy and mobilization around demands that, from a revolutionary perspective, are nothing. Right. And you have had some thoughts that you want to share more about that.
Well, one thing is a perplexity as to why that is, but it's got to be an index of a problem with the left, because those kind of demands should be emerging from a left, and they have to go towards a future, and not providing them tends to be an implication that somehow the future will be somehow assured if just the system collapses. And I think some's future will be, but it's not necessarily ours. And it's difficult to understand because the people who should be articulating it speak in a language they can't possibly coalesce anything, can't be understood. And they speak as foreign spectators, not as participants. And if they speak as participants, they're participants at a ridiculously low level, which are just, an exaggerated presentation of some of the things that are being done spontaneously. And that's a recipe for eventual disaster. And so that's a problem that bothers me. And then this is more on a theoretical level, but you speaks of the event, of unexpected cataclysmic changes in circumstances where what hasn't been possible becomes possible. But then he speaks of the process by which the event is politicized and extended, and it involves the separation off into what he calls the militants of the event. The militants that maintain the event. It's kind of based on Sartre, I think, too, as a notion similar to that. And there's so little of that. The approach, so much of the insurrectionists and other aspects of the left to the immediate struggle is one that does not lead to the development of militants out of the struggle. People end up as they were before, and lots of them end up more cynical, and disabused of illusions they had before, but not presented with any kind of objectives that are not illusory to substitute for them. And it's too bad. And again, I think it's only through collective groupings that consider that as a problem that you develop any kind of solution to it in practice. But what I'd like to kind of emphasize as sort of a aggregate collection of where I'm coming from is the importance of developing revolutionary collectives that can function and see themselves as functioning experimentally, as considering a given context and the political options available to it and what the alternatives are, and then implementing a practical course and being able to evaluate that course in terms of the alternatives you haven't pursued. That's very difficult to do. It's almost exactly opposed to the traditional Marxist-Leninist organizational model, which is essentially line is determine the line, then organization determines everything. This is don't determine the line, determine the options, and an organization considers the options and changes the position. And I don't know. I know it's utopian to think in terms of those groups forming as little isolated cells and then eventually merging, because there are so many factors far more factors in some ways that prevent that kind of merger than those that impel it. But somehow that kind of framework has to be there and has to begin to operate and has to prove itself productive to its participants in such a way that it can expand. So there's a bunch of nothing. So one thing I wanted to mention about Janine is when we were busted in Chicago at this anti-Nazi demonstration in jail, the main cop guy who was trying to figure out what was going on, he came into the cell I was in with this other guy and said, is it possible for you to talk to that woman we arrested? Because she's totally abusive and uncooperative.
Beautiful. It's really beautiful.
A true comrade.
And she was.
That was not a ploy.
They wanted to know what we were going to do with our short sticks, because we got busted and we all had short sticks up our sleeves for whacking the Nazis, and hers had rolled out in the police car on the way there. And
Well, I'm sure she told them what she was going to do with that short stick. Yeah.
no, she told them nothing.